Right on cue.
All right.
Yeah,
I think we have enough for a quorum, right? I know Erica is going to be a little late today.
I think we do.
All right, great. All right, so let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag, of the United States
of America.
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible.
With liberty and justice for all. Play ball.
If we could have the roll call, please. Roll call first, then public meeting notice. Or am I mixing that up?
Ready for the roll call?
Roll
Chairman?
call.
Dan Pistato,
Present.
Jay Lewitt,
Here.
D Mello,
Present.
B Reyes, M Russo,
Present.
Jay Sanford, E Seitzman.
All right. Open Public Meetings Act announcement regarding notice. I would like to advise those present that notice of the special meeting of the Housing Authority of the City of Hoboken has been provided to the public in accordance with the provisions of the Open Public Meeting Act. Notice of this special September board meeting that has been scheduled for Tuesday, September 21st, 2021, was sent to the Jersey Journal and Star Ledger on Tuesday, September 14th, 2021, as a notification to the general public of said meeting, and sent to the city clerk's office in Hoboken on Wednesday, September 15th, 2021, with a copy of the agenda to be posted on the aforementioned bulletin board. I direct the minutes of this meeting to state that I have announced that adequate notice of this meeting has been given as required by the Open Public Meetings Act. In addition, I direct that the meetings of this meeting to state the following. As a result of the restrictions established by Executive Order 107 issued by the Governor of New Jersey with respect to the need to limit public gatherings to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, this meeting will be conducted exclusively through the use of communications equipment. This procedure is in accordance with NJSA 10:4-9.3, which states that a public body shall not be deemed to have violated any provision of the Open Public Meetings Act in conducting a meeting by means of communication or other electronic equipment. In addition, this procedure complies with Article 3, Section 7 of the Hoboken Housing Authority bylaws, which allows for participation in authority meetings by members of the Board of Commissioners by means of telephone, conference, or similar communications equipment. And Attorney, I believe you, Mr. Harold, I believe you have a addendum to that. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Yes, I just want to note that as a special meeting, the purpose of this meeting has been specified in the notice that we sent out. It's limited in that notice to a discussion of repositioning of the housing authority. It's a continuation of the discussion that took place last night. And so far, there has not been much that has developed which might need to be discussed in closed session. There was no closed session last night. We will have to see how it develops tonight in terms of the issue of closed session. The public should know that there will be no opportunity for public comment that's not provided for with respect to special meetings, and that there will be no action contemplated to be taken tonight as a result of this meeting.
Okay, great. I guess this is the time to now hand it off to the people at Enterprise, correct?
I think it is. Tori and Shannon, who wants to take the ball first?
I can take the ball. Let me share my screen. Okay, what are we seeing?
We are seeing, you're not in presentation. We're seeing, let's see.
Go to presentation mode.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay. So first we can skip introductions. I think most folks know me. I guess there are a couple of folks who don't. I'm the founder of Factory Consulting, have been in the public housing world for about 25 years, and for the last 9 years ran the Houston Housing Authority. And we also have Shannon, who you heard from last night. Is Rob?
Yeah, Robin's not joining tonight.
Cool. So tonight we're just going to do quick refresher, and if there were questions on all of the information that you heard yesterday, and then kind of go through financing options, feasibility mechanisms, and financial modeling. So the quick refresher, why is Hoboken, why does any housing authority think about repositioning? And why did HUD create RAD? It's because they were losing 10 to 15,000 public housing units a year due to deferred capital needs that led to deteriorations, the unpredictability and insufficiency of the funding because it is the appropriations risk. And public housing has a bad reputation, so the public spotlight is high. An advantage of getting out of public housing is the regulations in the public housing world are thicker, denser, and more expensive, and efficiency is not rewarded. If a housing authority spends less, it gets less. So the big benefits of using RAD, you can stabilize the property revenue by converting from the public housing platform to a Section 8 platform. Once you have a long-term Section 8 contract, you can often modernize the properties, complete substantial rehab on distressed properties, or demolish and redevelop obsolete properties. Usually the second two requires leverage, which we'll get into tonight. And you can transfer Section 8 assistance to better neighborhoods. You can reduce density at properties if that's appropriate, and it gives you the incentive and the ability to streamline operations. It's all possible because you are going to RAD. We saw this slide the other night. This is the process. And so you have to go through all of those steps and you get out the other side. And then, and this is kind of what is going on right now. You get out to the other side, and then it's the big question, and the meat for tonight is, what is the financial feasibility? Does the property pencil out? What steps have to be taken to be able to make a property pencil out? So the four cornerstones of RAD have to be respected, and you're not allowed to change any of these things just because a deal doesn't pencil out. So the physical condition of the property needs to be improved and preserved for the long term. There's strong resident rights involved with RAD, public stewardship and ownership or ties are still in place, and a one-for-one replacement clause. So the most frequent question that we get asked is my property, does it make sense? Is it financially feasible? And that's what we're going to kind of explain how to answer that question in the abstract without specific examples to any one property at Hoboken. So if a housing authority currently has or can secure the financial resources needed to cover the next 20 years of physical needs of the existing property, as determined by your third-party physical needs assessment, or demolish and rebuild the properties, also then having new properties with a lifespan of more than 20 years, your RAD transaction is feasible. So that's the question that people are trying to answer is, once we see the physical needs assessment and determine whether or not that's the avenue to go or whether you demolish or rebuild, if you can get the money to do that, then RAD can make sense. The primary goal, remember, of RAD is the long-term physical preservation of this portfolio. That's the whole reason that HUD is doing this, is to keep these units active. That's why there's one-for-one replacement. You have to consider the difference between the capital funds that you get now in public housing and the establishment and creation of a reserve for replacement account and the annual funding of that account that happens under the RAD side of the transaction. So when we look at the financial feasibility first we determine that main question of, can they cover the next 20 years of physical needs, or can they redevelop the property entirely? And you do that by looking at the estimated useful life of all of the systems and components. And then you figure out how to fund the gap. And in most cases, with properties that are older, there is a gap. There are other ones where there is not a gap. And those we call no debt RAD transactions. So when we look at the 20-year needs, we look at the rehab scope, we look at the initial deposit to the reserve account, and that's a one-time lump sum that gets deposited in at the close to kind of start that reserve account for any immediate issues that might be coming up. And then there is an annual deposit that's made to the reserve account that gets built into the operating budget. So every year, your property needs to throw off enough cash to be able to make that deposit to the reserve account.
Corey, can I just
Yeah.
comment? This is Jaime. Obviously, there's a need for the annual deposit to the reserve for replacement, but can you clarify that the initial deposit depends on the deal? It's not a set requirement?
Yeah, it's not a set requirement. It's based on the transaction, and it's different based on the needs of the property. So if you have a property that you're not proposing to do a lot of rehab on, and your physical needs assessment shows there are things that need to get fixed, HUD's going to ask you to put more money in to get those things fixed. If it's a brand new building that you've built, the initial deposit is much lower.
Or zero, right?
Or zero.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there too for a second, because basically what happens is a third-party vendor comes out and they look at all of the existing components of the property, and they have a schedule that they build based on when all of the components were last replaced and what their estimated useful life is and the cost to replace them. So they build out a 20-year schedule. It's like an Excel spreadsheet. And they add all those things up together and they come up with a very large number, which is what HUD is looking to you to fund. And so that's where the combination of an initial deposit and ongoing deposits sort of tie into that.
And if the number is big enough, you might be asking, well, what happens if we don't have enough capital funds and other reserves to be able to fund these accounts? And the answer is you borrow the money. And so when we look at the differences between the old model of public housing and the new model of RAD, RAD is able to borrow money from a bank. And when you go to your friendly banker, they're going to want to know what your net operating income is. And you do that by determining your gross rent potential minus your expected vacancy to come up with a rental income number. And then the other income that you might get from telephone leases or things like that. So you develop a very detailed property income. This is how much property income is going to come in. And then you also do a very detailed property level expense budget showing these are all the things that we are going to spend money on to keep this property up and running. Now, generally speaking, public housing per unit expense levels are much higher than in Section 8. And there are a number of reasons why. There are the legacy costs, the contributions to the central office cost center, scattered site portfolios in public housing, and there are some other things that we'll get to in a minute. So the property income minus the expenses equals your net operating income. So the net operating income is the number that you would then take to the bank and say, hey, this property is throwing off $1 million a year of net operating income. And that's then what you can take to the bank and project out what that NOI number is for a number of years. And then the bank is comfortable lending you money, not all the way up to the limit, but they're comfortable lending you money against that flow of income that can get built into a pro forma. And so when the board sees pro formas, they'll see the income section, they'll see the expense section, and then they'll see the net operating number. And then below that is debt and debt payments. And that's how this comes in. Because the rent levels are set and they have an inflation factor, the only real way to increase your NOI is to reduce expenses. When you get to the closing table for RAD, there has to be enough money to be able to pay for all of the closing costs and the 20-year physical needs. And you've got to account, everything has to match. So according to the regulation of RAD, there's no additional or incremental funding associated with RAD. The 2018 Public Housing Operating Subsidy, capital grant, and tenant rents get locked in for each AMP to determine this is what the contract rent is. And that's been updated. Was that updated? Yeah, that was
Yeah,
updated.
it should say
2020.
2020. That's my fault.
They get updated every 2 years. So those get locked in. So that, and that doesn't really have any impact on you. It just means that you're looking at your 2020 income, not your 2018 income, which for the past several cycles of this have been good news for housing authorities, because housing authorities have seen their capital dollars go up the last couple of years. So the RAD rents are then higher and reflect those higher contract rents. And then what happens after that rent level is set, you are awarded an OCAF, which is your operating cost adjustment factor. And those are published by every state every February. And they're usually around inflation. They're usually not, huge increases. They are not decreases. So the good news is the RAD contract rent gets set, and rather than being flat, it actually grows with inflation, whereas public housing bounces around every year, depending on what Congress does. And sometimes we're funded at 84% of our operating costs, and sometimes we are funded at 88%. And so that's the big advantage of RAD, is that dependable, reliable funding source. But so this kind of shows the story.
Just to be clear on that, you mentioned that it was by state. Yes, it's HUD sets it with a percentage for each state, but it's not the state that's determining the operating cost adjustment factor. So It's all set by HUD.
Thank you. Yeah, otherwise New Jersey could say, hey, 20%. So in the public housing model, you have a portion of the money comes in through the capital fund, a portion of the money comes in through the operating subsidy, and a portion comes in from rent. In this example, it adds up to 574. Under RAD, the tenant rent is still largely the same, $210 contribution. And then the Section 8 HAP payment, which is your housing assistance payment, makes up the balance to the 364. And the way that HUD likes to frame this program is these things match. And so you're not getting extra money. And you might ask yourself, so why does anybody do this if you don't get extra money? Well, you can get extra money through leverage. You can get extra money through some of the Section 18 blends. And so there are ways to have these things not be exactly level. But as HUD designed it and as HUD speaks publicly about it, this is the model that HUD had in mind, is you would get 574 under both programs in year one. The real difference is in year two, even HUD can't tell you what that 574 number is going to be, because the capital and the operating could change based on what Congress does. But in the RAD model, you now have a 20-year contract to say you're getting 364 a unit. And so that gets locked in. So you're much more comfortable forecasting your revenue with RAD. Whoop. I think I'm just going to use the keys, not my mouse. So in public housing, all of the accounting for the expenses is done on the AMP level. And as commissioners, I'm sure you've heard Mark and staff talk about this AMP or that AMP. In RAD, in Section 8, the accounting level is done on a project level. And I believe that you have some AMPs that cover several projects, and then you have other AMPs that are just a single project. But it is a finer level of accounting in the Section 8 model. The public housing levels, and I had mentioned that the public housing levels are higher than in Section 8. And it's for a number of reasons, and it depends on the housing authority what those reasons are. But they often are the central office cost center, the scattered site operations, union wages, benefits, pensions, insurance underwriting, security costs are another one that are often much higher at public housing than in Section 8. And if you need to borrow money, you have to reduce the expenses, because that's the only way that you can really increase your NOI. So the expenses need to be reduced when you convert to the Section 8 platform to be able to show the bank a healthy level of net operating income to be able to borrow against. When you look at financially viable projects, your expense levels are 68% of operating income. And there are some that might be a little richer and some that might be a little high, a little lower. But that's kind of the ballpark that you would be shooting for as you're designing a pro forma to take to a lender.
So if I could make a comment here.
Yeah.
There are several ways that the conversion typically reduces the operating expenses. You don't have to make any special effort beyond doing the conversion. So one is, if you're addressing your backlog of capital needs, you can reduce your maintenance expense significantly, because much of the maintenance expense is dealing with the long backlog of needs that you haven't been able to address. But if you do a substantial rehab, for example, or new construction, the maintenance costs are going to be negligible compared to the historical cost, because you have all new systems and all new finishes and all new appliances, and the maintenance cost becomes that of preventative maintenance rather than responsive maintenance. And the least expensive form of maintenance is the preventative maintenance. Secondly, if you're doing a substantial modernization, or of course, if you're doing new construction, you're going to enter a whole new level of energy efficiency and address the water issues and electrical usage and sometimes solar and so forth. You're going to be able to cut your utilities costs. So those two items alone typically account for over 50% of the operating costs of a housing authority. So HUD is comfortable in your pro forma if you're projecting off the bat a reduction of 15% of your overall operating costs. They just expect that you'll generate these efficiencies, and also it's HUD's view that converting to Section 8 is going to reduce your administrative costs as well. I'll give it back to you, Tori.
Sure. No, thank you. Aaron, I saw you have your hand up.
He doesn't know he has his hand up.
Okay.
He's clapping.
Yeah.
There you go.
So-
Did you have a comment or question? Nope.
Oh, okay. So when we look at the financing options, there's a number of different financing options. And the first one is taking out a mortgage. And there are a number of different mortgage products out there. Most of the RAD transactions use FHA products. When they're doing a mortgage, you're not going to your local bank. Equity is another big one with 4% tax credits, 9% tax credits, and historic tax credits. And then you can use the existing funds that you have from operating reserves, capital funds, DDTF, which is your demo dispo transition funding, and sales proceeds, if there are any. And all of those can be used to inject into a project. One of the opportunities that's being discussed right now across the country is this big infrastructure bill. And there might be some big capital investments made to the Public Housing Capital Fund program. If that happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would say, oh, we should obviously stick with public housing because we just got this huge dump of money in the capital fund account. There could be an opportunity to inject those funds into a RAD transaction. Some of the language on that particular infrastructure bill is still being worked out, so don't take that to the bank just yet. And then there's other forms of financing, home funds, CDBG. If you have CDBG DR, disaster recovery CDBG, and FEMA funds, housing trust fund, federal home loan bank funds, and even city funds. So usually the city funds come in the form of home and CDBG, which is really federal funds, but the city also sees it as their funds to distribute. So those are kind of those are the primary sources that folks look at. And then once you have these funds, people use them to pay off public housing debt. A number of housing authorities have taken out EPCs, energy performance contracts, or have entered into the capital fund financing program. And so those loans have to be paid off before you close. They use it for rehab and construction. They use it for all of the soft costs, your legal counsel, architects, third-party reports, all of the lender and tax credit fees, and pre-development expenses. And up to $100,000 of capital funds could be used for that. And that could cover things like a planning effort. And then you can also use it to fund the reserves, to fund the replacement reserve, to fund operating reserves, lease-up reserve. And a lease-up reserve is while you are reoccupying a building and your occupancy rate hasn't hit the pro forma stabilization target. This builds in a reserve in case you're not able to lease up as quickly. And then finally, and perhaps most excitingly for many housing authorities, is the developer fee. And so developer fees can be paid on these deals, and housing authorities can share in those developer fees.
If I may comment on the pre-development use of capital funds, the $100,000 is sort of an automatic authorization per project. If an authority needs more than that in capital funds, that's also permitted. It just has to be built into the authority's 5-year capital fund projections and approved at the field office level. So that's not a limit, but that's kind of, it's automatically assumed by HUD that for each project that you have in the works, you can assume you can use 100,000 of capital funds to cover pre-development expenses. And those are your, basically all of the expenses prior to closing. So your architectural and engineering, your environmental reports, if you have a consultant, if you, if you have to acquire property to add on, or you're going to move some of your units to another site, those are all pre-development expenses.
And a quick question, is that would pertain per site?
Per site.
So in essence, every building would be its own site.
That's right. Every AMP is a project. You do have the ability, let's say on your main campus, because you've got 599 units, you may want to ultimately break that into
Multiple
sub-projects, and then you can get your CHAP modified when you get a CHAP or when you apply to break that into phases of development. And each phase would be a separate financially financed project.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
the 100,000 is really, all of your projects are much larger. Many small housing authorities with small 20 unit and 50 unit deals have much smaller pre-development costs.
It's not uncommon for a 200 unit property to have $1 million to $2 million in pre-development expenses if you're going to take on both debt and tax credit equity.
Yeah.
And then those are shared between the authority and the if you have a third-party developer partner, and that's negotiable on how the expenses are shared and how the fees are shared and how cash flow is spared. So that shared. So that's a negotiation process.
This is just kind of showing how the sources and uses have to match. And it's self-explanatory. The financing mechanisms, earlier you heard me talk about a no debt conversion. And these are the kind of the three primary ones, the no debt, the debt only, and then tax credits. So the simplest one is the no debt conversion. You're only using capital that the PHA already has. So capital funds, operating subsidy, and you don't take on any new debt. And so the closing costs are significantly less. There are fewer people at the table who need to sign closing documents. There are fewer documents to sign. And the housing authority funds its reserve account with existing housing authority funds. Then you go one more step in complexity to a debt only. So if your project has more capital needs than you can support on your own without debt, you take out debt. And then you get a loan to fund the full 20-year needs of the project. The project then would have enough NOI to support the new debt and to support the 20-year needs of the project. So then you're adding to the closing table a lender. And then the most complicated deal, or more complicated, would be using tax credits. So tax credits, for those of you who don't know, are issued by the IRS and allocated to all of the states by a formula based on, I believe it's population with some minimums. And so New Jersey, for instance, gets an allocation of tax credits. And then the Housing Finance Agency in each state conducts a way to issue them. Generally speaking, people refer to 4% tax credits as non-competitive, which is becoming less true in certain states, and 9% tax credits as competitive. That's because historically the 9% tax credits, they're worth more than a 4% tax credit, as you might imagine. And they have an application and a competitive process for developers to go through to get those. And depending on the state you're in, it could be anything from, 1 out of every 5 projects to 1 out of every 30 projects gets funded. And the 4% program, in many states, it used to be you could go to the Housing Finance Agency anytime you wanted and just say, hey, can I have a 4% tax credit? I can make a deal work with a 4% tax credit. And they would say, sure. A little bit more complicated than that, but that's kind of how it worked. Now, in some states, the 4% tax credits have become more competitive, and they only have those 4%. They give out all of their 4% tax credits very quickly. And you have to ask the state at the right time and be first in line or save a spot in line to be able to get your request in when they still have those tax credits. Otherwise, if you come to them, and let's say that time was January, and you come to them in June, they'll tell you, oh, we already gave away all of our 4% tax credits for the year. Once you have a tax credit, you then need to find somebody who can use the tax credit, because the housing authority doesn't pay taxes to the IRS. And so this instrument is basically worth what someone will pay for it. And that number varies depending on investment cycles and depending on real estate cycles and depending on the location that you are in. But the types of companies that buy tax credits are typically banks who have a community development requirement that they're trying to meet, so they can kind of double dip with requirements. So let's say you have a $1 million tax credit, and that $1 million tax credit then allows Bank of America to write off $1 million on their tax return because they now have $1 million tax return credit. But they don't want to pay you, generally speaking, $1 million to get $1 million off. They like to pay you something less so that then they can tell their investors, this is a great deal. We paid 95 cents on the dollar to get $100 of credit. So we're making money and we're not paying taxes. And we're doing good things like building affordable housing. So you need to bring in a tax credit investor who buys that tax credit, or you could go to a tax credit syndicator who buys the tax credit and distributes it to a bunch of smaller owners, and they become an equity investor. Often it also gets paired with a debt as well. So you would have now a lender at the table, and you would have an equity partner at the table. And the housing authority sets up a new affiliate entity that would own the property. And typically, housing authorities for these ownership entities create a single asset entity for every single asset. So you would wind up with a number of them. And the ownership structure would include the housing authority affiliate, and it would include the equity partner who has contributed equity to the deal. Typically, you would need over $35,000 of rehab or more than $75,000 per unit for new construction. Those thresholds are very easy to meet when you're looking at a portfolio like in Hoboken. The transaction costs are higher, and there is additional regulatory monitoring, compliance monitoring that takes place. So now your property managers at a tax credit unit not only have to comply with the Section 8 rules, they also have to comply with the tax credit rules. And that requires retraining, and it's a different set of rules. And they can have some really serious consequences. Like if you mess up on the compliance, the worst case scenario is you have to pay back the tax credit. Very rare. And most housing finance agencies, if you are new at this, will require that you hire somebody who's an expert at it to help you with compliance because it's such an important issue. It takes a lot longer to close tax credit deals than a debt-only deal, but you are getting, in essence, free money from an investor partner. So that $1 million tax credit over 20 years is a $20 million chunk of equity if they were paying 100%. And they're, yeah, go ahead.
If I can, just a quick question with the equity partner. Does that equity partner have to be a partner in the property as well, or can it just be in the building? For example, if we try to enter into a deal with a ground lease situation.
Yeah, you can do it with a ground lease.
Okay.
But the equity partner owns 99.9% of the building for the 15 years.
Typically something like that.
So we give up, technically, we give up the ownership.
You give up most of the ownership, but it's the piece of the ownership that isn't important to you. So they want the ownership to be able to get the depreciation from the property, and they want the ownership to be able to get the tax write-off.
But they
And
don't
these-
have control. There's a difference between ownership and control.
Right. So no control, but there's, and all revenues from the project is still revenues to
The partnership,
the partner.
a newly created partnership.
Mhm. But if they're not, so the partnership, the revenues don't necessarily reflect the percentage in partnership.
Correct.
Okay. All right, makes sense.
And
It
then
all gets negotiated.
And then traditionally at the end of that 15 years?
So I think there was the old traditionally, and there's probably the new expectations. So the old traditional, when this was a newer program, is at the end of the 15 years, the equity investor was like, hey, I'm going to give this property back to you and I'm going to exit, and I've gotten all of my value out of it. And that can still happen, but it needs to be negotiated up front. And there are some equity investors out there that are kind of like, we're not quite so sure we want to exit. But those are important things to negotiate up front.
Oh, yeah.
There are plenty, the volume of tax credit transactions that are going on now with housing authorities. It's definitely changed from, and Jaime probably knows more about this, from the Hope 6 days. I think there was some bad blood maybe from the Hope 6 days. And so Rad has taken the errors that were made during those programs, which is why you see that one of the requirements is that the housing authority maintains some level of control post-conversion. So, and they do monitor that. HUD does monitor that. So there's lots of ways when you're out searching for development partners. What generally happens is you put out an RFP, a request for proposal. But prior to doing that, remember we talked about sort of strategic planning and getting all of your goals coordinated. So you as a board and as a housing authority will already know the things that are important to you when you're searching for a development partner. and you'll put that out there on the street. And so you're only going to get people or developers, hopefully responding that are okay with what you are envisioning that partnership to look like financially, mostly speaking, but also there are other factors in there as well.
And each individual project can be financed differently, correct? I mean, this isn't an all or nothing
Absolutely.
situation.
Yep. And
So,
probably, yeah, probably.
A smaller parcel of land could be something that's like a no debt conversion to us versus, you know, a larger parcel that we may have to go into a tax credit situation. So we could kind of evaluate that parcel by parcel and figure out what's doable on each of those.
Correct.
Excellent. Glenn, Tori, let me make a comment about the debt only. I think there's actually a word missing in the first bullet. It says the project has more capital needs than in a straight conversion. The truth is that a debt only transaction gets less money to go into the capital needs of the project than a no debt conversion. The difference is the timing, so that if a project works on a no debt conversion, if you can space out the 20-year capital needs so that the net operating income going into the reserves is sufficient to meet those needs as they arise over the 20 years, you get the maximum amount. You get 100% of the net operating income going into the capital needs of the project. When you have a debt only project, you have no more net operating income going into it, but you've got to pay interest. So the interest reduces the amount of the net operating income that goes into the capital needs of the project. The reason to do a debt only, in my view, in my experience, is if you have so much in immediate needs based on the capital needs assessment, you might have a roof, you might have 2 elevators, you might have to bring your, to use a case in point, your infrastructure equipment that's in the basement up above sea level. That's going to be very pricey. So your capital needs might not be all that big if everything else was in primo condition, but you would need to spend a lot of money up front. That would be the signal that a debt only would be in order.
Yeah.
And then, Tori, if I could make one clarification, the tax credit allocation is spoken about in a 1-year allocation amount. So if you get a 1-year allocation based on your application, that's $1 million a year for 10 years.
10 years. 10 years.
And then the compliance period is actually 15 years. So the investor is at risk throughout the 15-year period. And that's why they typically want to stay in that length of time. But they've taken advantage of the actual tax credits. They've used those credits up in the first 10 years. So that if you had a 1-year allocation over the 10 years, that's actually worth $10 million.
Okay.
So when we look at the universe of what's happened to date with RAD transactions, 44% of them have been no debt, 20% debt only, 8% have been using the 9% tax credit program, and 28% have been using the 4% tax credit program. So you can see, the 9% are harder to get. Not as many of them get used. And a lot of folks use all 3 or all 4 of the different methods, but there's not any one best method. It really depends on the property and the property needs and the goal and the level of either light rehab, deep rehab, or demolition and new construction. So looking at the debt only ones, There's a number of slides in here that we won't go through in detail, but there are a number of different products that your developer partner would want to explore and see what makes sense. And there are different things that might make sense in different situations. So FHA has a number of products. One of them is the 223F program. This is for light rehab. Repairs can't exceed 40,000 a unit, and you have to do the work in 12 months. And only one major system can be replaced. There are no guarantees, low interest rates, and it works well with Rad. Davis-Bacon wages aren't required, and you can do developer fee and cash out. The 221D4 is a program that I see get used a lot more. This is for substantial rehab. You have to exceed 40,000 a unit. You can have up to 2 years to do the repairs. Guarantees aren't required. Low interest rate, lock in for 40 years. You can cash out. And the challenge with the FHA loans is they are slow to close. They're not easy to get through the underwriting. There's a lot of back and forth. I was in a situation with a 221D4 where HUD counsel was requiring one set of language and Fannie's lawyer was requiring a different set of language. Both sets of language had been approved by Fannie at different points in time, and both sets of languages had been approved by HUD, but they spent a month going back and forth. This is just kind of, when you talk to people who know, they're like, yeah, FHA loan, you got to build in some time for that. The GSEs and the conventional loans are faster and they have lower costs. Sometimes they have higher interest rates. Oftentimes they have higher interest rates. They don't come with some of the requirements to meet the latest UFAS standards. And so there's something to look at if it makes sense. So the cons, the higher interest rates, they typically aren't the 40-year loans. So they're shorter term loans, balloon notes, variable interest rates. They often lend to a not as large of a loan size. Your debt coverage ratio is not as generous it is with FHA, and it requires a guarantor. And that's either the developer or the housing authority or the project itself. Tax credits, kind of most complicated. And I think I talked about most of these things. You can combine tax credits with Rad and with a HUD mortgage and commercial loans. I talked about the higher closing costs and the regulatory compliance. This is an important chart, and this is kind of what we were saying of how a ownership structure looks. So here's your stereotypical tax credit redeveloped deal, Garden Village Apartments. Currently, it's owned by the Housing Authority. In the future, it's owned by GST LP, a for-profit limited partnership, of which the general partner is GST LLC, which is an affiliate of the Housing Authority, and it is owned 99.99% by your syndicator. And that's what makes up the partnership. And there are a number of documents that the Housing Authority would need to negotiate and work with legal counsel on drafting. The partnership agreement is a very critical one of what is that relationship between the partners? How is cash flow split? Who has what guarantees? who pays for what, and who's liable for what, who can make what control decisions, and when do they need to ask permission to do things. What happens to the property in 15 years? All of those things get resolved in those partnership documents. So the developer fee is a big motivation in the tax credit program. And the reason for that is the developer fee paid in the tax credit program is higher than in traditional multifamily development. And the reason is the risk. So in a normal multifamily development, a for-fee developer might build a multifamily, and depending on where you're at in the country, take a developer fee of anywhere from 2 to 6%. And in the tax credit world, they can take a developer fee. Again, it depends on what part of the country you're in and what rules the HFA have set. But some states, you're taking a developer fee that could be 3 times that, could be 15%. And that's because there's so much risk involved in putting together the tax credit deals. There's a lot of pre-development costs and deals that are good, solid deals that don't get awarded 9% tax credits. So they need to compensate the developers to keep trying to submit applications so that they can get good applications. So a tax credit developer, they might do 3 rounds of tax credit applications before they get awarded one. And that's part of the justification for the higher developer fees that you see in the tax credit program.
But it might be worth mentioning, Tori, that the RAD program itself has a cap on the developer fee in a RAD transaction, which is set at 15%. And then they have another cap if on the amount of undeferred, non-deferred developer fee. So if can you go back to your transactional organizational chart, that one there? You see the purchase contract arrow there right in the middle. Technically, in a tax credit development, the owner sells the property to the new ownership entity, which it may have a controlling interest in. But there's normally not enough money to pay the authority for it, so the authority takes back the financing for it. But that structuring it that way, the partnership, this assuming that it's going to be an acquisition and rehab, not a new construction. But the partnership then earns tax credits on that purchase price, even though there was no real cash transaction there. So if the project is structured that way, then HUD does not allow the authority to take, and the developer and the authority to take developer fee on the amount of the self-financed part of the transaction. And this was because in San Francisco, these were enormous prices. And this was a paper transaction. And some folks at HUD got upset that the authorities were getting so much in developer fee off of deals that they didn't really put the money in. They didn't, really put up financing for the project. That's how that came to be. But it's only on the undeferred portion, and that undeferred portion can be later earned or received through cash flow. So it's not that they couldn't get the full 15%, but they can't get it all at the time of closing or soon thereafter. Some of it has to come out of cash flow.
Yeah, and I'd say it's very common that there is some deferred developer fee in almost every deal that I've seen. I think I've seen one deal where there wasn't deferred cash flow, but usually there is deferred developer fee.
Right. And the only other comment on tax credits I wanted to make is the reason there's two reasons why there are only a few 9% tax credit allocations. One, as Tori mentioned, is because they're competitive. The point scheme is such that public housing sites that are not in the best locations don't have the amenities, the neighborhood amenities that are part of the scoring of who gets the 9% tax credits. But the other reason is that usually there's a cap on how big the allocation can be under the 9% program. Might be $1 million, might be $1.5 million. Well, that's good for a 50-unit property or an 80-unit property or a 100-unit property, but it's not good for your 599-unit property or your 250-unit property. You can actually get more dollars in a 4% allocation than you can in a 9% allocation, depending on the size of the project. So for your larger projects, you probably get more equity out of a 4% transaction than a 9%.
And another thing that housing authorities will do is they'll do phasing as well, so that they can get multiple bites at the apple. And so they might split up their 500-unit property into 3 properties and go after tax credits for each one.
Exactly. In Knoxville, Tennessee, we did a master plan for one of their sites, and it was ultimately redeveloped in 4 phases, and each phase was about 100 units. And it was 4 successive years of 9% allocation, which is pretty unheard of. But yes, that's what ideally what phasing could do.
And then I think I've got 3 last things on tax credits. Very important is the LURA that gets placed on the property. That's the land use restriction agreement. And that's what makes sure that it stays affordable housing. It restricts the ability of the partnership to use it for market rate housing or for something else. And then oftentimes there are new management requirements for occupancy. So the state HFA will say, we'll give you this allocation, but only if you, housing authority without tax credit experience, hire a third-party compliance monitor to help you manage these compliance requirements. And then finally, if 9% tax credits is something that the housing authority is very interested in, it pays the 9% program in particular, but even the 4% program, they are they're political. There are, the New Jersey Housing Mortgage Finance Agency sets the rules, and they change those rules every year, and they are open for comment. And in some states, RAD transactions are given a priority. In other states, RAD transactions are given their own separate allocation. And in other states, RAD transactions are told, too bad, you don't get any special treatment. And so in states where there have been a number of housing authorities have worked collectively to change the rules of the game so that their RAD transactions could get more tax credits than they could under the current rules, is something that I encourage housing authorities to think about as they're getting into this game of, this is something where politics does get involved. So moving on, last several slides. So I think we just covered this. And you've got your competitive ones, and then the 4% are less competitive. But 4%, even though they're worth less on an allocation basis, you can get bigger allocations. 4% is more complicated than a debt only. You have to use tax exempt bond financing to get the 4%. Oftentimes there still is a financing gap that gets filled by either GSEs or conventional or FHA debt. There's no cap on the size of the project or the number of awards to a single developer. The 9%, as we have said, is the most difficult, requires more than $75,000 of rehab or new construction. Competitive, very hard. If somebody's really interested, they can look up the New Jersey Housing Finance Mortgage Agency Qualified Allocation Plan to see what the current scoring criteria is. As Jaime mentioned, there's often caps on the sizes of the projects, and usually they are low. And you have to have an experienced partner, developer partner, to be able to win the credits. And you would have to have a plan B in case you don't get the awards. Or you have to have a longer time horizon to be able to go after the award several times in a row. And then addressing housing authority concerns around debt and equity. So we often hear folks say, we don't want any debt. You know, we don't want any new debt, but we don't want any debt. We don't have any debt now. Shouldn't we want a debt-free property? Other housing authorities say we want to do everything ourselves. We don't want to partner with anybody. We don't want to work with a developer. And the developer is taking too much, more than their fair share, and we're giving away everything. And then the last one is really we lose control of. So those are the big concerns that we often hear. I don't know, Jaime, if you hear other concerns, or are those the top ones?
Those are, well, you know, another one is they blame the Rad program. They say Rad makes people do tax credits.
Yep.
Which isn't true, of course.
And if folks have any of those concerns, we'd love to be able to talk about them in this training at this time.
So let me just comment on the one that I just brought up, which is, you know, when people tell me we don't want debt or we don't want tax credit equity, I usually say to them, I said, well, HUD doesn't care. You have to submit a financing plan that shows that you know what the 20-year capital needs are, and your plan can address those 20-year needs. And if you can address those 20-year needs with a non-financial transaction, that's fine with HUD. If you choose to do it with a debt only, that's fine with HUD, if you can cover the 20-year needs. If you want to do more than, so let's say, you know, on a non-financial transaction, you might be able to put in $5,000 a unit for some emergency stuff that needs to be done and some health and safety issues that the inspector came up with, and you can finance that out of your capital funds. But your reserve contributions that come through the operations, the net operating income, take care of the 20-year capital needs. HUD is agnostic about your approach as long as it addresses the capital needs. So what I say to people who say we don't want debt, I say, fine, if you can meet your 20-year needs without debt, do it. But if the capital needs are such, and that's why you have to have a third-party independent capital needs study. You know, if you could get by with a $5,000 per unit in a non-financial conversion upfront, then that one would work for you. If you need 15,000 because of your roof and elevator and moving some infrastructure around and getting some more accessible units and so forth, and borrowing helps you do that, even though you put less money into the property overall. But if your 20-year pencils out, that's fine with that. If your capital needs are such that you need to invest $80,000 or $100,000 a unit to do, you know, your 60-year-old electric system, plumbing system, address your water issues, windows and doors and appliances and roofs and elevators, well, it's the condition of your property, the needs of your property that drives what you need, whether you do it through Rad or if you were a private owner, you'd still have to raise the capital to address the capital needs. So it's the property that's driving your choices about how you plan to deal with their preservation or demolition and replacement. That's my speech
Very well said, Jaime. Very well said. I think it was said very well. I think if we can go back to the last slide, because I think these are things that are on all of our minds, right? I mean, we're not hearing it, but these are things on all of our minds. I think Jaime put it very well on this idea of, do we take on debt or don't we? And, you know, when we look at our properties, what are we going to do with these properties? They're 70 years old. The systems are failing. We're in that situation, probably of the latter case that Jaime was talking about. You know, if we don't do anything, you know, we could be among those units nationally that are just becoming so dilapidated that they can't be used anymore. If we don't do something with our properties, and again, I'm really, you know, the main campus, Harrison, Andrew Jackson, you know, 10, 15 years from now, they're not going to make it. They're just not going to make it under the financing through capital fund and with decreasing levels under the public housing. I think at some point we need to be realistic here, that we need to do something. And that's why we're here.
Right.
I think we realize that. And, you know, I've heard a lot of residents talk to me about that. Mr. Recco, if we don't do something, these properties in 10 years are going to go under. These systems just can't stay. They can't stand another 10, 15 years. They just won't stand. So in order to do that, once we take a look at what our cash flow is and what HUD's been doing to us under operating capital fund, you know, my belief is that we must be taking a look at some of these other alternatives on partnering, go into deals wisely, keep control of the property, yet bring on partners, make sure that, you know, our land use regulations are good, that everyone has a comfort level that we're not going to lose low and moderate income housing units in Hoboken, that we're guaranteed that these units are going to stay for the next 20, 30 years, that the housing authority has that amount of control, that we are sure that they are not going anywhere, that we're able to build up enough reserves not to replace things on HUD's depleted capital fund schedule, but that we can replace systems, appliances, what have you, repairs on a realistic replacement reserve level, not on HUD's measly capital fund level. We need to get into that position through this process. This is our opportunity to be able to stand back and take a look at Harrison and Andrew Jackson in X amount of years and say, yes, we actually did this. We stabilized these properties so they can be low and moderate income affordable properties for the next 50 years. Because if we don't do anything, the one thing I can guarantee you from my seat is that they're not going to make it another 10, 15, 20 years. They're not. And we're not serving our residents by doing that. And Jaime, you gave your speech. That's my speech.
Okay.
That I think it's crucial that we take a realistic move, and us and the board and the residents together and the Hoboken community say, we just can't sit back and watch these properties deteriorate further.
So Mark, I'll put an addendum on my speech. One thing, and Harold may want to chime in on this, but a lot of authorities say, you know, the authority shouldn't take on any debt. And what may not be clear to you, the commissioners, is that when you do a repositioning with debt and equity, the authority does not take on any debt. The authority does not guarantee the debt. It is the project's debt. It's referred to as non-recourse debt.
But Jaime, that then goes into the question that last question right there, lose control, right? And I think that's a concern for everybody. So understanding the debt situation versus the control situation and how they're intertangled there. I mean, I said it last night, I'm more excited now than I have been, and I have a ton of questions. I mean, from ownership of property and doing land leases or property leases for projects like this, is that something that's feasible? Do we do certain projects alone? For example, if we're going to first project out of the gate, we use an existing piece of land that the authority owns that's not necessarily residential land at this point, and is a project feasible to start the ball rolling in maybe a debt-free situation where we're just doing that ourselves because it's a smaller project. Like I said, I mean, I could kind of list a number of things here. Like, are there any properties that we look at right now knowing that we're going to rehab them? Or are we in it, you know, we're in it for a penny, we're in it for a pound, to say we're not even interested in a rehab situation where we're really looking at more of a demo situation and a rebuild. And if that's the case, then let's start eliminating some of these multiple options that we've been presented with over the last 2 days, because I think that allows us as the commissioners to focus on the things that are real versus the things that are just conceptual that we're not going to participate in. And I think that's, at least for me, it always helps for me to kind of narrow things down and focus on those that I know are real. So those are just some questions that I have for Director, for you and everyone else on the call. I mean, if we're looking at a demo all kind of a project, whether that's immediate or in phases, I think that's the first question.
So I'll jump in if I may. You know, Shannon last night did a good presentation showing you all the options, right? The RAD options, the Section 18 options, the blends. But then, one of my takeaways from last night, I shared it with Dave Stemble earlier today, is that I think it's true. You know, you listened last night and you picked up on the fact that some of these don't apply. You know, some of them you don't qualify for. Some of them don't generate enough money for what you probably want to do. Mm-hmm. And so you're not going to be interested in those, and that's fine. But that doesn't make your decision for you of your policy and your objectives of what you want to achieve. So when you know, there's that interplay between the authority coming up with its strategy. So after Shannon presented all the options, she then started talking about strategy and how you build a strategy. And that's where you are now. So you're getting the TORTI team is looking at, well, what's the maximum potential if you wanted to do a total demolition and redevelopment of your main campus? What could come back there? How many units could it fit? What does the market study say is appropriate? Dave Mello and some of us have had conversations about it. Is there an area where the authority can generate some workforce housing that generates revenue for the city, that isn't a drain on the city's tax structure? Or what kind of market rate housing can you integrate into a property where, so on your main campus, you have an opportunity kind of to design from scratch, other than figuring out how you're going to phase it all, which is a whole different problem. But
sure. Or commercial that services our residents too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it maximizes the benefit to the residents, of course. So I think that, you know, you're at the point now where you've got the interplay of a deeper understanding that you're getting of the resources that are available. I think you have a good, you have an intuitive sense of the capital needs. I don't think you've seen, you know, third-party studies that document those, but at some point you'll have those, and that's a play. You know, if you think about it, here's what I say. There's really 5 things that you have to put together. You've got to figure out what your income is going to be, rental income, and that's mostly determined by RAD, but it's also determined by if you do any blends or if you can qualify for Section 18. And
right,
there was a lot of discussion about that. So you can have, you know, what the least amount of revenue you can get is if it's all RAD, and the most that you can get if it's all section 18. That's one. The second one, we haven't done any interaction with the authority on yet, which is what are the reasonable operating expenses? Okay, so you've got the income less the expenses. Well, the income we can kind of nail down by making choices. The expenses is homework, figuring out what are you going to have? Is it going to be rehab? How extensive is the rehab? What's it going to cost to manage it and maintain it afterward? That's an exercise. There are people who can do that and help you do that. If you get a developer partner, they're responsible for leading that process. All right, so you've got the revenue, you've got the expenses. Then you've got the capital needs. And you know, we're learning more and more about the capital needs of your properties, but you haven't had any formal studies done. So that's something I think enterprise may guide you on as you go forward.
And
Then you have the program.
On that point, I think not only the capital needs of the projects, but really the sustainability of the project as well. So potentially wants in that regard is something that I'm really going to focus on, because I want to make sure that these buildings are sustainable through their lifespan. I mean, we talked about flooding yesterday a little bit, right? Like I'm not putting our generators at the basement level, right? Like I want to make sure that these are designed and developed a certain way where that sustainability is in fact in place.
And along the lines, I think you said the wants. I wasn't sure that. Yeah. So these are called owner add-ons, right? So when you look at what's the competitiveness going to be of these units in the future, and what amenities are just expected, right? So you're up against a lot of handicaps there, because you've got buildings that are hard to add more storage space to them. You can't put a shed on the back of a 6th floor unit, right? So where's the additional storage? And you have no adequate storage. You don't have adequate closet space. You don't have enough bathrooms in the units. You have all kinds of building constraints on basic amenities. So anyway, just let me pick up where I was. So you got the income, you got the expenses, you got the capital needs, you've got the programs, which you talked about yesterday. And then how you put that all together in the framework of your policies and objectives, your residents' needs, your community's wants, so the consultation that you've been taking on, and come up with an overall strategy and plan that then deals with how do you sequence this? How do you make it work feasibly? So Tori's kind of leading the discussion tonight about the feasible side of it. How do you determine it's feasible? Tori, I'll throw it back to you to weigh in on this. You've had time to chew on these topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think, these are the top concerns that we hear. Partnering for many housing authorities is a no-brainer. If the housing authority has never been in the development game, you're going to have a partner if you want a tax credit. If you don't want a tax credit, you can try to do development, and it depends on the capacity of the housing authority, and future opportunities. So the housing authority I ran, we won a 9% tax credit. We did 4% tax credit development on our own, but it was a huge expense and an ongoing department that needed to be fed and budgeted for. And, in a place like Hoboken, there aren't a lot of new development opportunities outside of what you control or could trade for. It's not like Houston, where there's land everywhere and you can just go try to develop something.
Right.
So, I think that partnership is one of those things that for Hoboken makes a lot of sense, especially given the scale of what you're trying to do. I think in terms of losing control of the property, hopefully between the points raised last night with Shannon and tonight with me, the commissioners understand you don't lose control of the property. You have a different type of control. You share control. And in some cases, I've found that the added oversight by the lender or by the partner is actually helpful for our own internal systems.
Mhm.
You know, the bank wants to know every month what your expenses were, what your revenue was, what your occupancy looks like. They will have a standard, you know, set of requirements that they want to see every month that they get reported on. That's helpful for many housing authorities who haven't had to think in that way about tying occupancy to revenue and on a monthly basis, how much am I ahead of my pro forma or behind my pro forma? So I actually think that some of the things that the partners do are actually designed to help you be successful. They want you to be successful so that you can pay off the note. And then certain pieces of the control get negotiated. And that's an important piece to spend some time on with your counsel about exactly what decisions are you making on your own, what decisions can they make on their own, what decisions are notice and consent, and what decisions are just made on their own. And so that's something to definitely have a good understanding of before you sign the deal.
You know, when you issue, when you go out looking for a developer partner, you would issue a request, typically a request for qualifications, and get a pool of respondents, and you may narrow that down and get a short list, and then maybe ask for actually specific proposals for specific sites. And looking at your nearby neighbor, NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, I was helping a New York developer bid for the first time on a public housing Rad transaction, going after the NYCHA opportunity. I guess it was started 3 years ago. And I couldn't believe what NYCHA was limiting them to. So, well, NYCHA said, well, first of all, you cannot apply for any tax credits, 9% or 4%. You've got to bring your own equity into the deal. Because NYCHA gets its own percent of the 4% allocations in New York State. They didn't want to lose anything that they were entitled to. All right. Next, they were saying that the authority should get the lion's share, and I believe it was nearly the total share of the developer fee. And I said to this major developer who was pursuing this, I said, do you really want to have your first housing authority transaction be in the toughest market in the country with the toughest housing authority in the country and not be able to use tax credits, which you used on every other one of your developments? And anyway, they applied for it 3 years in a row. They finally got an award under it. But my point is that the authority has a lot of control. You have to look at what you're bringing to the table. You know, you've got the land, you've got the building, you've got the tenants, you've got the relationship with HUD. You may have the local political relationships, and you know, that's a lot. And so you have a lot of control in the negotiation. Now, you may not get proposals that are responsive exactly to what you're asking for in your request for qualifications, but most RFQs that are out there, requests for qualifications, specify the authority wants a generous share of the developer fee and you know, cash flow participation, and the what they call a right of first refusal under certain terms at the end of the 15-year tax credit compliance period. So you want your counsel, whether it's your corporate counsel or in partnership with a HUD specific counsel, you want your counsel to come help you craft the procurement process to your benefit.
Right, but Jaime, I mean, don't we need to make those, the basic decisions before we even talk
Yes.
about a request for
Yes,
qualification?
yes,
I
but
mean, so that's why I asked some of the questions, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to talk about rehab anymore if no one's really interested in rehabbing a building, right? I don't want to talk about Rad versus Section 18 if in fact one of those really doesn't apply. And if both of them apply in different circumstances, that's fine too.
Yeah.
But I want to make those determinations, right? Like for me, and I'm only one vote on the board, but I'm more likely to want a ground lease situation than a ownership of land for any of our equity partners.
and I think that one goes almost without saying. There's no reason to
Right.
give fee simple control or ownership to the partner. And also, when the authority retains the land, you're more likely to be in a stronger negotiating position
Always.
to maintain your payment in lieu of taxes relationship with the taxing authority.
Right. And from the city's perspective, right? Remember, I wear two hats here in this conversation, right? Is it something that from the city's point of view, do we enter into a redevelopment zone where we as a city could require more of the housing authority, which then allows us to explore the option of the Section 18 rather than Rad? Is that something that's doable? Again, I don't know, but these are conversations that I think are imperative for us to have and have them very quickly so that we could keep the ball moving. Because honestly, if we're looking to go out for a request for a qualification anytime soon, I think these basic concepts need to be decided by this authority so that we know that we're moving in that direction. Because again, I don't think these are questions that the general public is going to have an influence over, in the sense of what our partners or our neighbors or other stakeholders in the community want to have in this conversation. They're probably talking about more of what the community will look like, some of the commercial opportunities along our properties and things like that. But when it comes to a Rad versus a Section 18, no one's talking about that, right? That's going to be made by this board. Those are the decisions made by the board and the administration and the housing authority. And I'd like to make those decisions sooner rather than later, because that, in my opinion, keeps that ball moving quickly, or as quickly as possible, without being too haphazard.
I think where you are in your process is you may well want to consider a request for qualifications or request for proposals for repositioning development advisor. So somebody who is just a consultant, it's an eligible capital fund expense. Somebody who's on your side of the transaction that helps you shape your overall plan with the inputs that you're getting from the various parties, from the enterprise team, from the ThirdParty team, from your community consultations, your resident council and resident inputs, and help you form the structure of your strategy to where somewhere in there you're gonna, ultimately you're gonna need some partners, and then they can help lead you through that process of procuring those partners. On
But
your
can't we,
question of, what to do with each property, I think it's probably a little premature to be too firm about that. My own perspective is that you'll probably have a continuum of decisions on that. So in my mind, looking at your properties, and I've spent a fair amount of time looking at them, you have properties in two different categories. You have what I would call standalone properties. So Adams and Monroe and the ones that are kind of satellite properties, plus the one that you've already converted, if you tore them down and you didn't have any more land, you'd be replacing something pretty similar to what you had at a huge cost. And so there you want to do the cost benefit of looking at substantial rehab versus tear down and new construction. In my own view, you wouldn't get a whole lot more out of tear down and new construction than you would in a substantial rehab on those satellite properties, the standalone sites. Although on a couple of the sites, and this may get discussed further as we progress, a couple of those sites have enough land on them that you might be able to add some structure, either expand a building or add a separate independent or connecting building, but not connected on every floor for a high rise. That's hard to do. But so you have those kinds of options, but you have something from just a rehab, and if you do just a rehab, you're going to probably lose some units in that building because you may have to move off-site some of the ground floor units, and to get accessible units, sometimes you have to combine units and you'll lose some units. So thinking about your commitment to the community, to one-for-one replacement, how do you deal with that? So those are the issues. But I think that's the least least costly, but perhaps most cost efficient, and still meeting. You have to weigh, does that meet all your objectives for the improvements, amenities you want in the buildings, and so forth. To the far end of the spectrum, where you're looking at your main campus, where if you didn't have to, when you do have to address this, the issue of how would you phase it and how would you deal with relocation, temporary relocation, and so forth. So in my just toying around in my own mind, I'm thinking, well, if you can tackle the quote unquote easier standalone projects first and generate some developer fee for the authority and get some better cash flow going and some experience going, while you're doing all the additional studies, looking at the underground infrastructure on the main campus and interplay with the city on their plans for dealing with the floodwaters and the separating the stormwater from the wastewater, that gives you time to figure out what to do with your main campus. So anyway, those are just off the top of my head some thoughts.
The main campus is our big priority. It's deteriorated. It's not the easiest place to live. I think we know enough about funding regarding Section 18 or RAD or the other programs that with the revisions to the Section 18 program, it seems like the most appropriate for the main campus. It'll garner up the most funding and loans from HUD. I think they will loan you up to 90% of the cost of the project, I read today.
I agree.
So I think we need to proceed very quickly with what model we want to go after. Also, regarding relocation, we would build a building on the campus first, I think, as a relocation building, because relocating in Hoboken would cost more than the project.
And that's the one part of prior attempts at doing this that I want to keep, is that I years ago suggested that we build that initial building to be the spillover spot so that nobody has to get relocated even off of our properties on the surface parking lot across from the left field of Mama Johnson Field. Like across
behind
the mailboxes there. That's a
behind
pretty
the chicken place.
Yeah, so it's a pretty substantial service parking lot, because I know the original plans were to build it on the rather smaller surface parking lot next to the senior building across from Connor School. And that didn't make sense. It blocks all the air and light from the seniors. It's much smaller. It just didn't seem to make sense. That surface parking lot's pretty big.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, Director, I know you're not going to like this statement, but I mean, the administration building is a building that it's not a residential building, right? We could relocate, temporary relocate our administration building and start there as well. There's properties that are owned by the authority already that we can start to build and build to the standard. Number one, the standard that our residents deserve, and number two, without any differentiation between what we are proposing to build from any other building in the city of Hoboken, right? And the director and I had this conversation. Why should anyone ever assume that the residents in the housing authority should live any other way than any other resident in the city of Hoboken? Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to have the state-of-the-art fitness center and a concierge service, but they should have amenities. There should be common areas. There should be potentially recreation areas. There should be other things that there is no way that we can afford those residents in a rehab setting. There's just not. We don't have enough room in the current building structure. And for me, again, I'm only one voice on this board, but for me, I don't think we should talk about any rehab, because I don't see any building in our current stock that affords us the opportunity that we want to present to our residents. I just don't.
Well,
So
except for Fox Hill.
I'm gonna interrupt right there.
Sure.
So the challenge is, although it would be great to be able to demolish and rebuild every single building, you have to weigh that against what you can actually afford to do.
Sure.
And so
That's the best point I've heard all night.
yeah, and so while it's probably possible to do some demolition and new construction, I can say right now that I'm probably 100% sure that you cannot afford to do all of your buildings. And so that's
Right now.
where you,
Right now.
right
Can't afford
now,
to do all of them right now in the immediate future.
well, you also have to think about the timing of all of that, and to Jaime's point, the cost benefit analysis, which is we know the main campus is the priority, which also means that it's going to be, and it has a lot of issues that it's going to take quite a bit of time to work through.
But I have to push back, Sharon. I'm sorry. Excuse me for interrupting. I'm the representative of the 3rd Ward where Christopher Columbus Gardens is. And you're not going to tell me that the main campus is any better or any worse than Christopher Columbus Gardens. You're just not going to tell me that, because I deal with those same concerns well before I was ever on the Housing Authority, whether it was my past experience here or my current experience here. Those residents have the same concerns and the same issues that residents in the main campus have versus residents in our senior buildings have. They're the same everywhere. No building meets the standard that I would like to present to our residents. Just doesn't. I think we have to look at this from that perspective. And yes, are some buildings capable of being maybe later in that transition? Absolutely, without a doubt. And I think ultimately we can't stop and we can't have a short-sighted view of achieving the goal of replacing each and every building in our authority, Because at the end of the day, for me, it doesn't even stop there. There are other properties in the city of Hoboken. The director and I have had this conversation. Why can't our residents live on the water in Hoboken? Why can't we find a building up on the water or a piece of property where we could potentially build a building so that our residents have the same opportunity as residents who live in Maxwell or at the T building or in Marine View? Our residents deserve that too. And
We also want to be, I mean, sorry to interrupt, Mike, but we also want to be cost
It's not
efficient.
realistic.
We want to be cost efficient, you know,
I don't think that's unrealistic at all, Andrew, at all.
Well, you're talking about putting up, where's it, what space do you have on the waterfront? Give me a plot of land that you can build a Hoboken Housing Authority property.
Right now, there isn't one, but we haven't explored the option.
So it's not realistic.
Why isn't it realistic? Why
Yeah,
can't,
but
why can't we build on, I'm sorry, why can't we build on lots that we currently don't own right now?
Because you have to
That's
purchase
what
them.
developers do.
Well,
And
you
that's
have
what
to
we're talking
purchase,
about.
you have
Mike,
to purchase them.
Yeah, it would
And-
just be,
Of course we do.
it would just be a
So-
choice of if you could buy twice as much land in the back of town or 1.5 as much land. Why,
If you're not-
Yeah, just to say you're on the water.
Buy the
What's
higher
point is
price
timing
tag.
of all that? Why are we limiting ourselves into the most immediate future?
Because
Why are
it,
we
because
talking
it's
about
not
practical.
in
realistic.
terms of long term?
It's just
It's
what
not
housing authorities have
realistic. It's
done.
not cost efficient.
Yeah, what housing
It's
authorities.
not cost efficient to spend $20 million to build 5 units on the waterfront when you can have, for $20 million, you can have thousands of units on the Northwest. Just so you can say you provided a resident with a New York City skyline.
No, it
Yes,
has
I would
nothing
love
do
to do
with-
that.
Andrew, that's nonsense. That's a nonsense statement because that has nothing to do with it. What I'm saying is that the
What are you
ultimate
saying?
goal of the
I'm
housing
trying to get to
authority-
what you're saying. What are you saying when you say, why can't our residents have a plot of land on the waterfront? That's
Why
not-
should our
I-
residents be segregated to one area of the city?
That's what I think you're trying to
I
say.
agree. I agree.
That I
Yes,
agree with,
that's what you're
Michael,
trying to.
but-
That's
but-
different. That's different. But when you say the
It's not
waterfront,
different. It's
that's not
exactly what I
realistic.
said.
No, you said the waterfront. That's not
Anywhere,
realistic.
Andrew, anywhere. The Northwest, the Southwest, the North.
I agree with that. The waterfront is impossible, not realistic.
Is it
That's
any
it.
way
That's
to
all
do
I'm trying
a
to say.
study before you say no? Is there any
I
way
think,
to
look,
look
I think-
into this before we say no? How, I don't think we all know what we can and cannot do yet. Pardon me, I don't want to speak for you, Commissioner Russo, but I think you're trying to say if it's possible, we should be looking into different opportunities and giving our residents different places to live, land swapping with the city, et cetera, if something is possible. Is that what?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
And that is what's going on right now. So I think there's a little bit, it's great that everybody's so excited.
It is, it's wonderful.
Very nice, Shannon. I like that.
I love this.
However, I think we're digressing.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'll jump in again too, but you, Shannon, what do you have?
Yeah, no, I just so that everybody's aware, I mean, what is going on now is that we are exploring all kinds of opportunities. We're not, and we're not going to limit the possibilities because of just no desire to do something bigger and better. It would only be that, remember, you've got to remember the sources and the uses. The sources and the uses have to balance in order for you to actually have a feasible transaction. And so that is what we're exploring here is, you know, hopefully by the time the first quarter of next year comes around, we'll have a much better grip on what could work financially and what can't work.
And I think commissioners, one area that commissioners are often more effective than the executive director is in making that pie bigger. So if the pie is bigger, if your sources are bigger, you can dream bigger and you can do more. That usually means money from the city or money from the state. And right now we have this opportunity that there might be a big chunk of money coming from the federal government. If your pie suddenly got really big, yeah, you can shoot for the moon. You can do all of that. But if your pie doesn't grow, the TORDI team and the enterprise team are just looking at the resources that you have and the common resources that you could get and telling you what's possible with that amount.
Let me segue on Tori just a little bit, because again, I'm so excited about the excitement here, about Councilman Russo's excitement and his let's get it done.
And sometimes I get a little excited.
I like it. Where we are, let's not forget, is where we are is we're putting together this plan right now. We are reaching out and taking a look at what other parcels are available, how to do deconcentration, how to move some of our assistance elsewhere. We're looking at all of that right now, and we're putting together this plan with community input of what do we want to see, what does the community want to see, and then what TORDI and Enterprise in cooperation with Enterprise is doing is going to be packaging that up and coming back to us and saying, this is what we think we can do. This is what we think we can do at Adams. This is what we think we can do at Monroe. This is what we think we can do with the main campus. This is what we think we can do at Christopher Columbus. They're going to be running those numbers and saying, what is it going to take to tear down and rebuild Christopher Columbus? What's it going to take to do a substantial renovation? So we have the information to make those decisions. That is what that process is about right now. And once we have that information in hand, and it's not that far away, we're only a few months away from having that process done, we're going to be loaded with that information to be able to make those next steps, be able to make that next step toward that RFQ, be able to decide what's in that RFQ. I think that's where we are right now, is we're getting there. We've done a lot of groundwork. We're taking a look at the lay of the land. And the reason for that is to present to this board exactly what our options are. And that step needs to be completed. And then we'll have a much better idea, Councilman and all, of what the next steps the Housing Authority can do. And I think that has been our plan from the beginning, and we're getting really, really close to that. And I think I want to make sure Tori agrees with that, Shannon agrees with that. That's where we are in the conversations we've had with the TORDI team and ourselves, is that's what we want to be able to bring to the board in the very near future. But
Director, I wholeheartedly agree with that, right? And I just want to make the point once again, that I'm not saying that we're going to do it if we can't do it. I'm saying that we need to explore all of it.
Sure.
Because do you know what the residents heard in that transaction just now? The residents heard, we're only good for the back of town.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you why I know that.
That's not what they heard.
Wait a minute. I've lived here a long time, and a lot of those residents have been here just as long, if not longer than me. And they have heard that. They have heard that for years.
All right, but they didn't hear it. They didn't hear it tonight.
They did. Andrew, they did.
No, they did not.
Hey, but wait,
Well,
guys, if I could interject.
that's not what I said. So I don't know who said that.
All right, if I could interject, I agree with, I think the part of that I'm getting from that you're saying, Mike, that I most agree with is that, yeah, the residents shouldn't feel like they're cordoned off in one part of town. That's why, when the city very recently has been what designated the north of the viaduct area. What's the official name of that area?
North End.
Yeah, the North End. I mean, I look at, we got everybody concentrated here. We now have, thanks to your father, Michael, we have the light rail back here. We have a 2nd Street light rail stop. And that's why I mentioned commercial earlier.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to be near mass transit stops, not strictly residential. That's very poor planning. Any planner would tell you that, right? And maybe we could link up with one of those landholders in the North End and get an exchange where we get more acreage, where we can put more housing in exchange for maybe the property that directly abuts the 2nd Street light rail that could use some commercial. Who knows? Or maybe we could even, I don't know, do a 100-year land lease where we acquire more property, don't even give up our property into perpetuity. We only give it up for 100 years, and they build a commercial building. I just want us to think outside the box, and I definitely want us to do some things to more pepper our housing stock that I don't want to lose any housing, but pepper it around the community a little bit more. Because the only thing I would disagree with what you said about like Columbus, and I don't think you were trying to say this, but I do think the people in Columbus are in a slightly better situation because they're not ostracized onto this campus. I almost feel like we're trying to make it sound nice by calling it a campus. It's the land in the 50s that they wanted to stick the public housing in because it was the worst property in town. And I think we need to try to unwind that a little bit when we do this process.
Absolutely.
And just so we're on the same page here, I completely agree with everything you just said, Dave. There's no, if we can find properties in Hoboken where we can put some of these buildings, it's a win-win for everybody. It makes the community more diverse. It creates that non-campus feel, that back there, that over there land, and that's fantastic for our residents. But we have to look at all these options in a realistic manner that makes sense and not waste our time with these crazy ideas of acquiring land that's just, especially in Hoboken, is way too much. The city, and this process has to involve the city because some of these plots of land they own. For example, there's the old PSE&G site. That's a site that potentially we could have property on. There's
just expanding the campus and keeping them in the same spot that they've been in for 70 years.
I'm just throwing out examples. There's the spot on where the senior living is supposed to be going on Willow and 12th or Willow and 11th over there. There's even the land the city just is building $100 million park. Maybe we could have had a parcel of that where the housing authority could go instead of spending $100 million on a park, so that we can say we have another park. The Northwest has plenty of land that developers have that we can negotiate with. So yes, there are properties, there are options. I at no point tonight said anything about not having property that's segregated in any way. I fully am on the same page with both Mike and Dave and what they said, that we need to have these properties more intertwined with our community. It's better for everything involved. Diversity, economics, social justice, everything that we're trying to do as a community is hand in hand in trying to get these properties put all across Hoboken. But we have to be realistic about it. And the biggest thing that I worry about is the options that we have in building a building, knocking a building down. We're talking a very long time to get this done. And I'm excited about seeing the options of doing that, and financially how we're going to be able to do that without losing the control that we need as a housing authority to make sure 100% that our residents their interests are always kept to the fullest degree, and there is no compromise at all. And when you're dealing with money that you don't have, sometimes you have to leverage some of that to get what you want financially. And I hope that we don't have to do that. And I'm going to ensure that doesn't happen on my vote.
But that's exactly what I want to do. And you say leverage. I mean, and I'm going to keep going back to this as an example. Like that we have property directly next to the 2nd Street light rail as an example of something very valuable that we own, that we could leverage to get more. The example I received in the courses, you guys might have received the same example. It's not in our area, but like across the country, you might have a housing authority that has a prime piece of property that, let's say, a McDonald's would want, or somebody like that, a massive food chain, because it's at a crossroads, right? Or a gas station or something like that. And they do a 100-year land lease on that land. And then they get twice as much land in another part of town. That's perfectly fine for residential, but wouldn't it be ideal for a commercial spot? I just want us to leverage what we have. And our most valuable asset is our land. And as long as we go into it saying we're not going to lose a single unit, but we're willing to move the pieces around to get pieces that are more conducive for our goal of not segregating our population into one spot, and our goal of getting as much land as we can that might be a move that we have to do in our own local way, like they do out in the middle of nowhere, where they take a crossroads piece of land and lease it to a retail establishment for a boatload of money, and then they get more land in another part of the town. That's a good thing.
Yeah, we are, I shouldn't say me, we collectively, Torty team and everybody, are definitely looking at all kinds of options, because we agree that, again, with what everybody said, that you need to deconcentrate the housing if at all possible. You have a unique challenge in Hoboken. Tori, what did you say? It was the third densest populated city in the United States.
Yep. Yeah.
And you're only a square mile big, so there's just all kinds of challenges that come, and you're a hot market. So you've on top of the cost of construction and relocation, all that stuff, you've got a bunch of unique issues that also have to be dealt with. And we're working on it. So
We're not fully developed. I mean, you go north of the viaduct, there's what, 5-6 blocks worth of surface parking lots with Academy buses parked on them. We're not,
And
we can still
listen, even on
squeeze
our
it
own
out a bit.
campus, even on our own properties, we have a lot of land.
We do.
I mean,
We're not very dense.
we have, I mean, honestly, if you're looking just at the big buildings that we're talking about here, right? I mean, if you incorporate the field itself and the parking lot, you have half of the battle won there. I mean, we have a situation where and Andrew, you're the first one to talk about it. Why aren't our kids don't use the field as much as they should? Right? I mean, we have an asset there that we need to explore. We need to explore that. We need to explore the parking lot. We need to explore the administration building. We need to explore all the parcels of land. Christopher Columbus Gardens, that entire block could be maximized. You can knock down one of those buildings, fill up, move residents, knock down a building, start building. You could build 2 big buildings on that parcel of land. There's land to be used, and it will not take 20 to 40 years. We could do this in a 10-year period and literally rebuild the entire housing stock and add to it.
Well, that's also, I would love to hear from our professionals here, what does that roadmap look like? Very specifically, let's say we built a building to start on the parking lot, right? What does that roadmap look like? What's the finance look like? Obviously in a very quick way, but can you guys kind of walk us through what that looks like? How many years? That, once it's built, then I would think you would move out all of the people in another building that we're then going to knock down, and you just go right down the line and then knock that building down. So give us a roadmap of what does that look like?
well, that's what we're working on. So we don't have a roadmap yet.
Right.
So the point of last night and tonight.
Has anyone in the country done it?
Oh yeah.
I mean, obviously it's.
Oh yeah.
So can you give us an idea of what that
I can give
roadmap
you
looks
an
like?
example. Sure. Let me give you an example. So I'm working with the Housing Authority of the County of Santa Buenaventura, California. And they have had, let's see, how many units was it? I think it was 140 units of public housing. And they decided to, that it was obsolete in nature, although they did not pursue obsolescence, Section 18, and they decided to redevelop it in 4 phases. And so what they did was, as Jaime, I think it was Jaime that pointed it out, that so each phase is its own separate financial transaction. So each has a rad chap and et cetera, et cetera. And so the phase 1 residents, now here's the other challenge, although Ventura has the same challenge in terms of low vacancy and everything, the first set of residents, which was 72 households, were moved out with vouchers. So they have their own
Sorry,
voucher.
you said with vouchers?
Yep, they have their own their own housing choice voucher program.
Uh-huh.
So they gave the residents vouchers and they relocated them for 24 months to, within the private market.
Right.
Then they demolished phase 1 and rebuilt, I think 131 units that replaced 72 units.
And all those people moved into that building?
Well, because it took so long, it took 24 months, half the folks decided that they would stay where they had relocated to. And then half the folks moved back in. And so they were able to lease it up with folks off the waiting list.
So is there a way that, I mean, that's a great starting point. That's a good example. And I'm sure there's tons of things we can pick and choose from that example. My first question right off the bat though is there a way when you give the housing choice vouchers that there's tied in that they have to come back?
No.
Unfortunately, yeah, you can't.
But you don't even need them to.
I
Yeah,
know,
you don't
but-
need them to. The bigger
You don't
issue
lose
there is
funding?
the bigger issue is finding them places to rent.
All
Right.
right, guys, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to be respectful of the time that we said this session was going to go on tonight. All right. We're already a few minutes over. So are there final thoughts or next steps that we can kind of wrap this up with?
Can you keep going with that example? I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean,
Sure.
I think that's
Well, what I would
or send it out, just email it out to us, or
Yeah,
I mean,
think
I'd love to read
spelling
up
that
on how
out and
that
maybe
went.
some more examples would be great, you know?
Yeah, I would suggest, what I've suggested to clients is that, they look at a few good examples that are somewhat comparable. And one that I've mentioned to this group before is Norfolk. Downtown Norfolk had a 618 unit project built on a filled in river. And we master planned it and got them a $30 million choice neighborhood grant to kick it off. And it's going to end up, being well over 1,000 units by the time they're done. They're well advanced on the building all offsite first.
Right.
Because the city had some parking lots that they gave them and so forth. And the authority has some.
Is that the Norfolk Housing Association?
Yes, it is. Norfolk Housing Authority, yeah. In Norfolk, Virginia.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll look that up. Thank you.
Yeah. But Mark, I think, that this kind of stresses the need that at some point the authority is going to want to have somebody under its direct contract you're picking up, that's picking up the momentum from all these other consulting inputs and helping you move forward, because you're going to be on a path for multiple years.
Mhm.
And it's time to start thinking about the timing of bringing somebody in.
The only thing I would say to that, Jaime, is I want to make basic decisions before we hire somebody, because I don't want to be wasteful. I want to make sure that we understand what we as the housing authority want to move forward with, or better yet, what we don't want to move forward with,
Right.
so that we're not wasting time. Because again, it's all coming down to money, and I don't want to hire consultants to figure out who our next consultant is, to figure out consultants for the next project that's going to be for the consultant, right? Like, I've been down that road many times, not only here at the authority, I've been down that road at the city, and it drives me absolutely up a wall. So I like to make some basic decisions as to what we are not going to do, so we eliminate those from the conversation, so we're not wasteful.
Clearly, that's our path, clearly.
Well,
So how do we do
a
that?
note to end on. Well said by Dr. Russo.
So how do we do
That's
that? How do we? Is this?
Yeah,
Do we
we can-
discuss those things
We
at a high
continue to
level?
communicate. We continue to have these types of meetings. We continue to get our ideas through. We look at the professionals that we've already brought on. We evaluate their reports. We take a look at the work that we're doing with enterprise right now. For example, we probably need another meeting before too long with, I've been working with Tori on ideas on how we should be staffed as we go into the future, like Jaime just mentioned, what we might need to make this successful over the next few years. So I think this is just the start. I think we're going to be relying on you folks to spend some good time and some good conversations with meetings like this to make sure we're on track. This is just the start.
Great.
It's just, it's close to the end, but I couldn't be more pleased with the kind of conversation that's going on right here. This is the work we need to be doing.
Okay, sounds good, everyone.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone.
All right,
Motion to adjourn.
Motion.
motion adjourned.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, have a
Thanks.
good
Good
night,
night,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Thank you, Harold.